Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Maybe I'm Just Not Getting It. I'm your podcast host, Robert Davis. I appreciate you all taking the time to tune in. Before we hop into this week's episode, just remember to follow me on social media. Instagram is RTD underscore III. Facebook, Robert Trey Davis III. Follow, like, subscribe, comment, everything like that on the podcast. It is streaming or I guess posted on Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and on YouTube. Same name. Maybe I'm just not getting it podcast. You should be able to find it on all of those. So like I said, just give those a look up when you can. I appreciate everybody's support, engagement, comments, everything, ideas, everything that you've given so far, or continue to give for the show. It really helps me keep it going as we continue trekking through the third season. And so, in today's episode, I want to talk about something. I want to talk about a topic, and this is kind of a rant. So I apologize if it seems kind of disheveled or quick in that nature, but I want to talk about Charlie Kirk. I think enough time has passed to where a lot of the vitriol has kind of died down from it, but had some thoughts on it that I really kind of wanted to bring forward with that. Um, and before we, kind of get started on that, I think it's important to say that I don't condone, political violence towards, or I don't condone violence in general towards individuals. I don't think people should be killed based upon, what their was solely their speech is, regardless of if it's hate speech or not. Um, I don't, I also think that two things can be true, and that you can respect the fact that somebody who is a father, a husband, a son, a family member, that has been killed and had their life taken, and also that person was a bigot or a hateful person or spread bigotry or hate. And both things can be true, and there's a way to talk about that respectfully, in a sense of both, in a sense of both concepts. And so that's what I'm attempting to do today. So we'll see how that goes. But just to kind of start, the murder of Charlie Kirk, and just to be clear, this is a murder. You're gonna hear me say it is a murder or assassination. I don't want to say the death of it because I don't want to talk about it in the sense of that he didn't die, he was killed. So the murder of Charlie Kirk, it has been a national talking point, or was a national talking point, and it's one that spurned I don't want to say it spurned a divide, and I don't think tensions had cooled down before then. I just think it was pouring gasoline in an already large fire. It almost caused a culture war, in a sense, of this division between the left and the right, or the conservatives and the liberals, or Democrats, Republicans, however you want to look at it, different terminology for the same thing. But it was really kind of a catalyst to another level of what I believe is kind of not giving a fuck in this country, really. Just in a way of saying it in kind of like the best way that I can. Apologize, my hair is kind of like doing its own thing right now. I'm trying to get it and like going all down my shirt. Don't get long dreads. Like, just save yourself from that. Okay. So there's been a lot, and the thing about Charlie Kirk's murder is there's been a lot of misinformation and exaggeration on both his, not both, but on his impact, on the circumstances of his murder, on his stances at that, you know, and I think it's important to try to clarify what those are and what those stand for, because I think to a degree there's been a little bit of a, I don't mean to use this term in a sense of punning, of being a pun or anything like that, but there's been a bit of whitewashing of his stances, of trying to say, oh, he wasn't, a bigot, or he wasn't, spreading hate towards the people. He just had his own opinions or his own thoughts about stuff. And I mean, he did have his own thoughts and opinions that he had a right to share. I'm not saying that he didn't, but yeah, in my personal opinion, he did. He was a bigot for his views towards African Americans, towards his views towards the plights that African Americans have faced in this country or continue to face in this country. His stances on immigration, his stances on LGBTQ, his stances on pretty much anything that was anti kind of like the existing white male. I don't mean to sound like a over intellectual here, but like his kind of like the white male conservative oligarchy type of figure. His stance against all of that, I believe, anything that kind of spoke differently against all of that was pretty much an issue to me, at least. And because he kind of spoke vehemently and disrespectfully about anything that kind of was uh, uh, against that, whether it would be black women, whether it be black men, whether it be Hispanic men or Hispanic women, trans people, just all of it just seemed to be, he spread a lot of thoughts and views, and he tried to use a lot of skewed statistics and points that I felt like further hurt this country rather than helped it kind of come together. And also I think his impact. I don't think he was as big of. I know that he was a growing right wing media personality and voice. I don't think that his impact was as large as people say it was. I think it's been over amplified because of his murder, but I don't think his impact was as large as people gave it credit for. I think a lot of his claim to fame was arguing with college students and younger minds that just weren't as developed as his, didn't have the experience or the viewpoints or the knowledge of the world that he had. And I think that was it's easy to sound smart when you're talking down at people, And some of those college students served him up, quite frankly. I've seen a lot of his debates. Like some of those college students served him up. And, I think when he's tried to debate people, I think that were his age or that were his same, I think, intellectual kind of standpoint, I think in some of those he struggled because his points I don't think were as concrete as he made them out to be. You know what I mean? So that's just my honest opinion on it. And just the circumstances of his death. I mean, there's many conspiracies about, is the government telling the truth? Is it something to do with, the Palestine-Israel conflict? Was it something to do with Trump or the Republican Party and they didn't like some of the things that he was veering off into because it was going different than what the mainstream Republican MAGA talking points were? And, it's a thousand different things. And I don't think we'll ever know. And I'm trying not to go too hard on conspiracy theories. I try to talk about if I believe in something that may not be proven, I'll say that on this platform. But I try not to promote too much of that, and I try to stick with the facts of the matter. And then I'll say this is what people are thinking or something like that. But I try to stick with most likely the facts of the matter because I do believe that unless you know something, you kind of have to stick with what you have unless you can prove otherwise. And so, like, I also think that his murder highlighted, or not even his murder, just the reaction, the whole thing of it has highlighted kind of this high level of desensitivity that we have in this country to tragic events and violence. And that's on both sides. That's not one particular party or the other. And that's not just based upon, what happened to him. We have a mass shooting every other week, it seems like, at a school or at a public place in this country. Like I'm originally from New Orleans, where you could see two murders on on the evening news, them covering two murders every day. And, like do become desensitized to it. You do become thinking, oh, this is just normal. It's just how things go. And I think that is an issue within itself, But I think as a country, we have become a lot more desensitized to what is going on, to these acts of violence, and to where it's easier for us to talk about them in a way of removing kind of our thought, our emotions, and our empathy from it, and talking about them in a way that seems callous or cold. I think a lot of people talk about this subject and especially and on both sides, I think. And let me stick with the liberal or the left side of it, and make jokes about it, or he deserved it, and blah blah blah, in ways. And I've been guilty of it as well, and I shouldn't have, in ways that have that can be, like you said, callous or cold, or way that we wouldn't want God to see us acting in. You know, and I think we have to keep in mind again that this is somebody, that this is a human being. This is somebody's father. He had two little girls, I believe. It's somebody's father that is not coming back. They lost their father. Like like the lady, whether you think that his wife cares about him being dead, or is having an affair with the vice president, or whatever crazy stuff they got going on, she lost her husband. He was murdered. Like like that's something that impacts people, and it's something that we should have a certain level of empathy and understanding for. And I mean, I think again, two things can simultaneously be true. As I said when I started this podcast, I'm gonna say it as many times as I need to get it across. You could be a bigot who spread hate speech, and you can also be murdered unjustifiably. And I think a lot of times we have a problem trying to identify, or trying to reconcile with the fact that both of those things can be true. Like, because he was a bigot, he deserved what he got. No, he didn't. He didn't. He didn't deserve to be shot in the neck in fucking Utah by what appeared to be some crazy lone shooter. Like, no, he did not deserve that. Regardless of whether I think, what I think his thoughts would be of me, or whether he would have cared if it happened to me, or whatever. Like, he did not deserve that. And I think it's just easy enough to kind of to stay at that point for a while, and just like sit with that, to say that should not have happened to him. And I think a lot of things, regardless of him being a bigot or not, and it doesn't make him less of a bigot to say it shouldn't have happened to him. It just shouldn't have happened to him. Like David Duke was a former senator in my, I believe, or U.S. House of Representative, in my home state of Louisiana. He's a fucking KKK Grand Wizard. Publicly. Check the Black Klansman. I think that's who, was it Topher Grace, or whatever his name is, played in that. When he dies, I'm not going to mourn him. I'm not going to mourn him. I'm not going to sit there high five and celebrate either. But I ain't going to give a shit about it. I mean, and I think, but the respect of saying I understand that he died, and as a human being that left this earth, I think that's all that I can give, and that's all that I need to give. But I need to give that. You know what I mean? At the minimum, or at the most, I need to give that, I should say. But so why does this topic matter? Why did this murder Charlie Kirk, or this whole thing kind of matter? I believe. First, yeah, like, this was a horrific act. Like, obviously, like, this man was shot in the neck and killed in front of a public audience. And not a public audience that was expecting it. It wouldn't matter if they weren't. But like, he was shot and killed in front of a public audience that was there to debate. It wasn't a violent exposure. And so, yeah, that is a horrific act, first off. And, the murder of a human being should not be celebrated, regardless of how you feel about them. Again, I'll keep saying that. So, I think that's one of the first things, and one of the biggest things that we have to kind of beat into people's heads, that we should not sell. I said this on last season show when I talked about the United Healthcare person. Like, we shouldn't celebrate murder, regardless of what we think of the people that died or that were killed, regardless of who they were, regardless of the legacy that they left behind. Because when you leave this earth, you do your legacy. The things you said is what you have to stand on. And so Charlie Kirk is a bigot because the stuff that he said, and what his legacy is going to be what he said, what he presented, what he stood on. And I'm gonna judge him by that. But I'm not. But that's it. It goes just as far as that. I'm not going to celebrate and care about his murder. Like, celebrate his murder, though. That makes no sense. And like, this is another escalation of, or another example of an escalation of political violence and like the increased extremism in this country and the increased tension in this country. And I mean, I think that goes back to the desensitization of it. Like, I think people are more willing to commit extreme acts of violence. One, because they're more seen, you see them more on TV, so therefore they're more normalized. It seems like for some people, they feel like that's the only way that they can have their 15 minutes. A lot of people are like, oh, that's, I need to make a statement, but they really just looking for their 15 minutes of fame. And for them, that's their way of getting it. Um, and it's sickening, really. I mean, because it just adds to the tension that we have in this country. That they're seeing, they're spewing this kind of cultural cold war that we have between the left and the right, where everybody's seeming to be just waiting for the first shot to be fired to kind of just say, "Oh, fuck it, let's go to war." Um, and you had two white guys in the news just like last week got arrested for trying to have a plot to overtake Haiti. Like the fuck, like like these examples of people just doing like of us taking on these roles of extreme violence and extreme acts because a lot of time we feel like, oh, there's no other way, or I gotta do something and stuff like that. Like it's to a point to where it's beyond, it needs to cool down. We need to have just like moments of self-reflection and empathy for each other, and empathy for others outside of who we feel like we should have empathy for. Empathy shouldn't come with a, a cost, or like a deservance. Like empathy should be generally. And I think that's one of the things, that we don't feel empathy, or we don't try to feel anything for people that we don't feel like are on our side, quote unquote, or are in our position. And we think of them as like bots or NPCs when they're real live human beings. Like a lot, there's like the bot NPC type thing. We really think people don't like aren't real living creatures anymore, and it's just things that go into this, like to just go into the ground or the sky or something like that. And like we have to get back to really viewing and valuing each other as human beings, regardless of our thoughts towards each other. And the reason I say that is because the only way that we start coming to common grounds and changing each other's minds through actual conversation, through actual. I'm not big on the debate culture, the thing that Charlie Kirk promoted, but like through actual conversation, through actual debate, through actual empathy for one another, through actual understanding for one another. That's the only way that we get, that these changes that we want to see in each other come. It's not going to come from us digging our heels and our feet in the sand and being like, fuck y'all, I'm not, y'all are the wrong side, or y'all are crazy, and I'm not doing that. It never comes from that. And like, one thing that I think why this matters, and I think it's so interesting, is that this is not probably the first time in this country, but it's one of the biggest times in this country that I think what has always been the traditional or the major group, your right wing Republican type of I don't want to say men, but type of talking points, or kind of view of the world, feels they feel as if, I can agree with them to a certain point. They feel as if they're being targeted for their speech. And I think that's so odd, because they've never really, in my opinion, never really had that happen to them before. While we can name off many civil rights leaders murdered for their stances in their speech. Um, Civil rights, whether that's African American, civil rights, whether what was the I think it was a city councilman in San Francisco whose last name was Milk, that was killed, and it was for gay rights. A lot of Black Lives Matter grassroots founders have been murdered over the past couple years, and I'm sure it's for their engagement in that. Like, we, God knows how many people that stood up for gay rights or stood up for immigration was killed, or their platform was defunded, or taken from them or something like that because of that. A lot of people can say they have been hurt or injured, or experienced hurt or injury, whether that's physically, emotionally, financially, religiously, family wise, whatever the case may be. Like, they can say that they've experienced some sort of hurt or injury because of a stance that they took or an opinion that they had. And I think it's so interesting that, for, like, in my opinion, again, for the first time probably in a long time, if ever, that right wing majority, historically majority view in this country feels like that's happening to them. And it's interesting because I think it's interesting to see their response and their kind of fear of this, like, oh, do y'all not see what's happening? And it's like, yeah, it's been happening to people for a long time. It just now is happening to you, or at least you believe it's happening to you as well. And a lot of times they were the ones that were doing it to others. And so it's interesting to see that. I don't know where they go with that. I mean, I know oftentimes white people respond to this sort of feeling like that they're shut up in a way that other races wish they could because they have the power to do so. And so I'm sure there will be some, some sort of response to it. But I think a lot of time their response is, oh, we're going to go to war back with you. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. But it is interesting that that is what's happening, because we just would have never seen that. We would just never seen that before. And, like, another thing that we want to talk about is just why this matters. It's just that we have to reestablish a level of social decorum in this country where mocking death shouldn't be allowable, or mocking death shouldn't be cool. I should say it shouldn't be allowable, because you should have the right. Free speech should allow you the right to say things even if people don't like it. As long as it isn't hate speech, you should be allowed to say things even if people don't view it as cool. But I don't think there's a place socially for mocking death. And I think that should be something that people look at and be like, oh, well, I ain't fucking with that. Or, mocking pain and hurt from death. I don't think, that should be something that we should be embracing. I also think that we need to increase, you're going to hear me talk about empathy a lot, because I believe empathy is one of the biggest it's one of the biggest things God gave us in order of trying to not fix this world, but living with each other and understanding each other. Because empathy is just strictly the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand their situation. You don't have to like them. You don't have to per se respect them. You don't have to per se agree with them, but you can understand what they're going through. You can understand what they're feeling, or you can understand that they're feeling and they're going through something, and just understand that at its base. And I think we have to have that when it comes to victims of violence, when it comes to people that are affected by violence, that are affected by these things. Just as much as we want that social decorum, it only comes from that empathy. And I really think that we have to have that for each other, because it's too many times when stuff like this happens that people are feeling like, oh, that's not on my side. Oh, that's not on my side. Fuck them. I wish it happened to more of them, or stuff like that, where that's not talking, and that doesn't come from a place of warmth. That doesn't come from a place of love. That don't come from a place of God. That comes from a place of evil, and a place of darkness that we really have to try to root out, because if we don't, then it just leads to more darkness, which is more of these extreme acts of violence, more of this tension, more of this this fear of just anything happening at any time because somebody feels like it needs to happen. You know what I mean? And I think, that we have to get back to establishing a certain level of social decorum, just to kind of make it uncool. I think too many times it's cool to do shit that's not cool. And it's cool to be overly dark and overly edgy and overly inappropriate, and everything just isn't a joke, and everything shouldn't be made to be a joke, or made to be a laughing point, or made to be a crude, rude comment just because we can say it. Freedom of speech, it captures a lot, but it really Like freedom of speech should be a legal concept. Socially, there still should be, in my mind, not consequence, but people should be able to be like, oh, I ain't fucking with you because you saying some real crazy shit that I just like. That's dirty. That's low. And I mean, I feel like that should be the social consequence within that. And like the other reason why I think this topic matters is that Charlie Kirk's death, quite frankly, was used as a promotional tool. And I think that's messed up. It was used as a promotional tool to promote a culture war where there was really no need for it. And the thing about the culture war thing is only those in power have gained from that. Like us as human beings, as citizens in this country, as just people living in the world, don't gain from warring with each other in any sort of way, shape, or fashion. War has always been something that has benefited those at the top and not those fighting it. Like, and this cultural back and forth and this cultural kind of quagmire that we find ourselves in, where it feels like people are looking for a reason. Because when Charlie Kirk was killed, you had people like, oh, that guy, it had to be somebody from the left. And even when it turned out that this young man was from a right wing family and blah blah blah, oh, it can't be that, and we're gonna get you liberals because y'all started this and that. Like, we were looking for it. You know what I mean? Like, we're literally looking for it. And this was trying to be used as like the first shot of the war, the first shot to start it. And like, you have to ask yourself who benefits from that, because it's not us, it's not the people fighting it, not the people arguing on the internet. And I think it's strictly those at power that want to be able to hurt us in the particular lines of thought, to keep us scared, to keep us anxious, to keep us looking at what they want us to look at, the type of information they want us to look at, to keep us thinking in the ways they want us to keep us thinking in, and without ever really coming, without changing that or without becoming different, or thinking differently, or God forbid, thinking about each other and coming together, because I believe it's more money and it's more power in separating us and keeping us divided than it ever would be in having us together. And to speak about just some examples of things that kind of bothered me, or things I wanted to talk about in terms of this Charlie Kirk situation. First, one thing that bothered me was that I know in death we tend to try to glorify things or glorify people. But again, I believe that you can respect somebody's life and death and still recognize it for what it was. And again, I can respect that Charlie Kirk was killed. I can respect, again, that he was a father and a husband and all these things and a human being. And I can still also say that I think he was a bigot. And I think he was a bigot, and I think one of the things I saw was, like on the internet, I know I saw like this meme a few times of him and talking to Malcolm X in heaven, and Malcolm X being like, Charlie, you're an okay white boy. And that shocks me, because it's like, or trying to say, oh, this is our MLK, this is the right wing MLK, or blah, blah, blah. And it shocks me because, for one, I think that is disrespectful to civil rights leaders in general, not just in the African American realm, but in general in this country and throughout the world, that have been killed for stances they've taken in trying to help disfranchise individuals, or individuals that were on the wrong side of the political or the power spectrum in their country. And the other part of that is Charlie Kirk may have been, he was a podcaster and a debater. He was not a civil rights leader. Like, I don't think I didn't see him as a civil rights leader for who? For white people, for white men, like, because they weren't in any civil liberty to begin with, civil liberty being taken to begin with. So, for one, I don't see him as a civil rights leader. For two, I just think that is another way of trying to lessen the legacy of others and promote or up the legacy of something else that just didn't does not need to be that. And I think again that you can recognize, like, who he was and what he did, and still be like, yeah, but then what y'all talking about is kind of tripping. It was not that much. It was not that serious. You know what I mean? And so I just think that trying to compare him to Martin Luther King and all that stuff is just a little bit ridiculous in terms of what he stood for and what he talked about and even what he did. Like, he debated on college campuses. He wasn't out marching in the streets. He wasn't facing police brutality. He wasn't facing fire hoses and dogs or people trying to arrest him or anything like that. And so I just think that whole concept is just weird to me. Um, and I spoke about this a little bit, but his another thing I want to talk about in terms of example was his platform. His platform was based upon debating college students and having a podcast. And I have a podcast. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but like, I wouldn't call myself a civil rights leader or an icon of anything because I've had that. And also, again, as I said earlier, I think the concept of debating college students and making your name off that is a little bit weird because you're debating, I don't want to call them children, but like, you're debating children that don't have the the same mental capacity at that age that you do at your age, or they might not have the awareness of everything going on in the world that you do at your age, or they might not know everything that's going on in the world that you do at your age. And it's easy, it's not like shooting fish in a barrel, but it's easy to sound smart when you're debating people that you have an upper hand on. And that's literally what I thought what I thought about a lot of those debate me, prove me wrong type of things, is that it's just talking to people that you feel like that you have a upper hand on. And frankly, you should never start a conversation with the concept of prove me wrong, like, because who, like, what, nothing comes from that. You're starting from a point of y'all are battling back and forth. It's just an intellectual sport and not an actual concept of trying to talk, hear, or empathize with one another in a way to change their minds or the way to get across to them. We're just debating for the concept of debating, just say, oh, I'm better, I made you look stupid, um, rah, rah, rah. But it didn't change anything. It didn't make anybody think differently. It was just an ego pitch. Um, and, he had, and to go back to why I think he's a bigot in terms of, if it wasn't clear enough already. You know, again, he had hateful views towards what I believe, hateful or separatist views towards, or hateful or separatist or devaluing views towards, blacks, towards women, towards LGBTQ, towards immigration, Hispanics. He mocked those groups a lot of times. I talk about George Floyd a lot. He mocked George Floyd's death. Um, and he promoted hateful type of thoughts, and he promoted hateful platforms and hateful rhetoric towards these groups. And so, in terms of why I think he's a bigot, or why I don't think he was, the cultural civil rights icon for the right that sometimes that for the 2 weeks after his death he was painted out to be, because after that 15 minutes of it kind of went up, nobody really talked about him anymore. But I just don't believe that was right. I mean, I mean, to spread those type of views, I don't believe, and to spread that sort of hate, I believe that follow you. That's your legacy in death. That's what speaks for you. And what speaks for him to me is hateful bigotry and separatists and trying to devalue people and trying to put them in their place, per se, that you felt like you were above. Um, and to speak about his killer, at least in terms of the government, because, like, again, I'm not going to speak too much on conspiracies. I do think there's more to this story, and I'll talk about that, a little bit. Um, Actually, probably very soon. Is there more to this story? Most likely. But to speak on his killer, in terms of what has been presented to us, it was a young white male that came from, and let me, before I start this, I don't try to and if I have in the past, I apologize. I don't try to group these killers into political fields or groups because I think that one, crazy is crazy, and you can't try to rationalize that. I've had many political debates with people that were on the other side from me, and they never thought that they thought, oh, I need to kill this person, or I need to kill, these people, or kill somebody in order to get my point across. Um, and this young man did come from a Republican household, but he also had from what we hear, he had a trans girlfriend. I think he had um, some thoughts that probably, or some viewpoints that probably were changing from what his family had. And he probably was questioning a lot of what was going on in the world. A lot of his own feelings and his own thoughts were probably strange and unusual to him. And I think because of that, you have, I mean, and it's the same for most of these people, right? I think a lot of these people are in situations where they have a lot of different thoughts going on, some of which they don't fully understand or they can't fully get a grasp on, which makes them more confused, more anxious, more angry. And then you take in family pressures or historical pressures from their environment and what they believe they should be or what they believe they should be thinking compared to what they are, and it all just becomes this hodgepodge of schema and thought. And I don't think it's right or even accurate to try to be like, oh, but you see that this was a right wing right white boy. He probably could have had different thoughts than that. Similar to like when the guy that allegedly shot Trump. I say allegedly 'cause I don't think that was real, but the guy that allegedly shot Trump, and it's like, oh yeah, well, technically he's Republican, but he also has these democratic viewpoints, and because like politics is a spectrum. I don't think most people are all right or all left. People are all over, what they believe in certain things compared to the other. And so I think just the concept of crazy being crazy is one thing, but the killer itself is another example of like a consequence of these extreme rhetoric and these extreme agendas, because sometimes with the extreme rhetoric it promotes an extreme response. This individual obviously felt like he needed to respond in a way to shut Charlie Kirk up for whatever reason he felt like he needed to do so. But at the same time, he like if there wasn't such extreme rhetoric going on, if there wasn't always talking about, kicking people's asses and murdering them and shutting them up for good and blah, 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 would he have gone to such extremes? I hope not. I think not. Um, and I think it goes back to where I was saying that we have to try to calm some of the rhetoric and some of the agenda, the extremeness in the agenda down when saying, all these people have to go and all, we can't, they're not American and they all need to be thrown in the dungeon or whatever crazy shit Trump is saying, this week compared to next week compared to the week after that. And you see why people react the way that they do. You don't see why people react. It's not justified. But when you turn up the heat on things like that, you got to remember certain people are living and dying by this stuff, and they're taking it to heart, and that's scary. It's really scary to see. Um, and we have to turn it down, and we have to try to be more understanding of let's cool this rhetoric, because we don't need no crazy shit going on, or nobody thinking that they got to take action within their hands to save their country or some crap like that. you know um and is there more to this story? I mean, in terms of, like, some people believe, oh, it had something to do with Israel and Palestine, or Israel might have been the ones that sent somebody to kill him because his thoughts or his views on Israel was differing from what the mainstream Republican thought of supporting Israel was, or was he close to exposing something? Part of that is, I think that because we have so much going on in this country and there's so little faith in the government, people are questioning everything in front of them, And I don't think it's wrong to question everything, but I do think it's wrong to question things without legitimately having a thought process to question it, or evidence to question it with, or even just reason to question it. And I think just questioning shit because the government lies is the government lies about a lot. They also tell the truth about a lot because they have to. And so I think just that concept of it at a base is kind of silly. And also, I mean, because I think of it like, the phrase or the saying that believing in nothing is the same as believing in everything. If you question nothing, if you question everything, you're doing the same as questioning nothing. You know, um, and I think we do have to kind of, in terms of this, will we ever know the full story of what's going on? Probably not. Does it even matter? That's a better question. Probably not either. Um, but is there? But was Charlie Kirk about to expose something? I doubt it. I doubt he had top level information to expose anything. But was it likely that he was saying some shit that somebody in a high position of power didn't like and said, "Hey, we gotta stop this"? Could be. That very well could be the case. And it sucks because, like most things that people have interest in these sort of conversations, we may never actually know. But in terms of going with where we are and what we've been presented, then we've been presented the fact that it was this young male that did it. And I know there's questions as to like holes in his story and to the gun and the ballistic testing and why he would be online talking about it randomly on a random day when he wasn't, on this random time when he wasn't talking about any other time and blah, blah, blah. And yes, the government has set up people before to take falls and have killed people before and set people up to take falls for it. And so it's not out of plausibility that this happened. I think, that there may be more to the story, and it sucks that we don't have an answer. And there's no answer for it, at least in what's been given to us. Maybe one day we'll see it. But for now, all we can do is go with what's been presented as this lone shooter. And the last thing as an example, or I kind of want to talk about is the college's standpoint. Like college campuses have always been arenas for young people to speak on how they feel about things, as they should be. And because politics is the way that the world is being run, and young people are obviously going to have feelings and thoughts about the way that's being run, then they're going to be always political type of events or rallies on campuses. There were in Vietnam, there were in the war on Iraq, there was in terms of here with Black Lives Matter and all that stuff. Like, there's always going to be, there are always going to be these epicenters for that. With that being said, I think there needs to be a sort of not restructuring, but revising what all of that, not revising, but limiting what some of those platforms look like. Because I think just the concept of free assembly and everything works. And I believe college students should always be able to gather and protest on things that they feel to be right. And if they have like-minded people, then they should all be able to meet and do that. I think the concept of like these protests with like the paid protesters that come in, where they're not students on this campus, and stuff like that. I think that can go, because I get that they want to protest and they have a right to assembly, but I think that the college campuses should be limited to those college students. I think when you're like some of the extreme type of vitriol and the police response and all that stuff that we've seen has brought bad press and bad experiences to some of these colleges and some of these students and some of these parents, some of these faculty members, that would not have been the case if it were just simply students doing it. I think the professional protester thing needs to be something that is in a public forum, sure, but not in a college forum. And similarly, the things that like Charlie Kirk was doing, like the prove me wrong, debate me type of platforms that come to these college campuses to debate with these kids, I think that needs to stop as well. Because I mean, I think if it's somebody like I've hosted panels on college campuses, panels in law school on college campuses, and that's fine. You know, to have panels that have people speaking their mind that may not be, but I think this concept of people coming in solely just to debate when there's no real emphasis on learning, there's no real emphasis on communication with each other, there's no real emphasis on any of that. It's just on, I just want to prove you wrong and talk over you and make you feel stupid or make you look stupid. And that's in no way going to make them change their mind. It's in no way going to make them see your point. It's in no way going to make them do anything other than that. I think that's just craziness. Like to even allow that. Like you need to let those sort of platforms again go do that at the park. Go do that. Go rent an event center and do that. You know, something like that. But let's stop using college campuses as proponents, and let's stop using, you know, these young people and these young impressionable minds as guinea pigs for, you know, debating points and you know, these political theories and shit like that. Like let them come into the world on their own and protest things they care about and things that they feel about. But all this other shit, like keep that in the public where you can talk with other grown adults. And just to speak on some of my concerns regarding this whole thing with the whole Charlie Kirk type of experience, I think, you know, like the first concern that I have per se is that we talk about this being another example of gun violence in this country. And another example, a downfall in terms of just an example of how freely somebody can carry and access guns in this country. And like to be clear, I'm a gun owner, registered gun owner, concealed carry holder, concealed carry license holder. I mean, I suppose you could say I'm pro Second Amendment. I do believe, you know, that people should have a right to a firearm. And I don't think that people's firearms should be taken from them. But at the same time, I do believe that owning a gun, not just owning a gun, having access to a gun, being able to buy a gun, having access to a gun, or even having the access to have access to a gun is a huge deal. And that's a huge responsibility. And I don't think enough people either realize that or care about that or have a respect for human life to care about that. And I think that's something that we have to try to to combat. You know, like you have a lot of individuals in this country that have access to a weapon or have access to a weapon, can get a weapon if they wanted to, who have issues with, you know, dark or violent thoughts, dark or violent tendencies, can't regulate their own emotions, are hyper isolated on the internet, consistently viewing, you know, violent content, are over almost obsessive with guns and violence and things of that nature. It's too many people that fall into these categories that have access to weapons and or just don't have impulse control or have an understanding of human life or have, you know, the understanding of the responsibility that these guns are. I just think that they're toys. And it's too many people that have access to these to guns that fall into these categories, which is just truly scary because owning a gun should be a huge responsibility. It is a huge responsibility. And it should be one that you take seriously. Every gun owner I've known, like every class that you can take, everything like that preaches to you trigger discipline. It preaches to you barrel safety. Don't point your gun at other people. Don't place it in ways that point to other people. Don't walk with it swinging around to where it's pointing at other people. Or, you know, like to always treat your gun as if it's always loaded and it's always designed, because it is a weapon that if you point it at somebody, you have to be with the intent to kill. Like, and every sort of gun firearm training preaches those two elements of trigger discipline and your barrel discipline first, because they want to beat it into your head that this is a dangerous weapon and you have to treat it as such. Don't walk around with your finger on the trigger because it may go off. Don't walk around just swinging, with your gun not in a position to where the barrel is, face down or faced away from people, because even if it's unloaded, treat it as if it's loaded, because you never know. And we have to go back to everybody having that understanding and everybody having that feeling towards guns, to where you can't just do whatever the fuck you want with it, and you can't just get one just for the fun of it. And I think, when we get back to, if we do get back to that sort of understanding of it, we'll be in a better position. But until then, we are going to stay in this world of, why did this person, when something happens, why did this person have a gun? Oh, they were able to get it from, a secondhand shop or a gun dealer or a gun show or something like that. And there wasn't proper background checks, or this person had various mental health issues that were documented. Why did they have a gun? Like, we're going to stay in this sort of realm until we all as a collective hold each other accountable to be like, no, we need to be serious about this, serious about understanding how dangerous this could be, and like, I think and to a point that I've already mentioned, Charlie Kirk was not a civil rights figure. He was solely a bigot. And, I don't think his hateful views should be minimalized. I talked about how I felt like it's been kind of whitewashed in a sense. Like, see people saying, he was like, just because he had ideas and thoughts that were different than you. Yeah, I'm not praising his death because of that. But if you ask me, do I like him or anything like that, because it's not because he had thoughts or views that were different from me. He didn't believe in rights that I believe people should have that look like me, or that were women or other people of color or trans people. And I believe that's an issue. Like, I genuinely believe that is an issue. And I'm not going to act like, oh, his views weren't that bad, or, he really wasn't saying all that, or, oh, he meant something different just because he was killed. No, like I said, when you die, the legacy you leave is the stuff that you built yourself on. And these are the things, these videos, the arguments and all this stuff. This is what the tweets, this is what he built himself on. And so that is the legacy that he's going to leave. And that's what he has to stand. That's not what he's saying. He can't stand. That's what he is living on. Or not living, sorry. That's what his memory is built on. That's what his legacy is built on. And if he didn't want that, then he shouldn't have done that in life. But I'm not going to try to whitewash it or make it seem like it was less than what it was, or, oh no, he wasn't, a bigot. He loved black people just because Candace Owens was one of his friends. But some of the stuff he was saying, it really wasn't like that. It was just taken out of context or in the wrong or the wrong clip, or no, it wasn't. And I'm not going to act like it was. And I don't expect people to act like it was. And if you agreed with what he was saying, I'm not going to expect you to be like, now that he's dead, I feel like he was wrong. And that's what you agreed with. So, it is what it is. And like, one of the biggest concerns, and I spoke about this before, is just that, I felt like his death was commercialized by MAGA for their own gain and their own political agenda. And the concern I have with that was that is a different concept in martyring somebody. They didn't try to martyr Charlie Kirk. I think some people did. And again, that's why 2 weeks, a month later, you don't even hear his name anymore. They didn't try to martyr Charlie Kirk. They didn't try to make him into a monument of what should be or what people should be. They tried to use his death to commercialize or to promote a culture war, to sell some T-shirts and to have a big fancy funeral with a whole bunch of right-wing people there, and to make themselves feel like they were persecuted. They didn't give a shit about Charlie Kirk per se, in my honest opinion. And I think that's messed up for somebody that committed their life to them, that they didn't give a shit about his at the end of the day. But you know, I suppose they had their reasons, and I'm sure somebody's taking care of his family, his wife and his kids. But I just think the way that the right kind of went about commercializing his death was sickening to me. And at some, like, the other point that we talked about is that one of the bigger concerns is that some right wingers and some left wingers too wanted to use this as like the firing shot for a cultural war, for a literal cultural war. And the fact that we are at that point that some people feel that way, I think is already bad. Like we're already, like, we should never feel like we got to go back to a civil war in this country. And the fact that it was used eagerly, like people were eager to be like, oh yeah, I gotta go clap me up a fucking liberal now. Like this is just the type of shit that we're into, the type of things that we're promoting. This is dangerous. Like, we talk about war as if there and fighting and violence as if there's not victims and there's not consequences and there's not cost to it. There always is. And I think that's what we have to get back to understanding. And I think to another point that I was making earlier, when someone is killed, we get into this judgment contest of, oh, what side were they on? Both the person that was killed and the killer. Like, what side were they on? What did they believe in? Oh, that must have been the reason why. Oh, that's your problem. That's your side's problem. They the ones with the issue, not us. And until we look at these things as a human problem, not a liberal or a conservative problem, that there's a lack of empathy in this world for one another because we see each other on a different side of a political aisle, or there's a lack of empathy for one another because we see each other differently based on our race, because, oh, you're black, so you must believe XYZ and I believe XYZ, or, oh, you're trans, so that means you're into all this weird shit that I don't believe in. And like, until we start seeing each other with empathy and start seeing each other as children of God and with a sense of love, we're not going to be in any better position, and we're going to stay in these sort of blame games of, oh no, that's on your side, and as a way of trying to distance ourselves and remain cold and callous and to stay from taking accountability. And that's just bullshit that we shouldn't delve into further, but we keep going further down that rabbit hole. And like, I think the conspiracy theories part, to the point of why I don't really try to promote a lot of it, is that I think some of them are all over the place and some of them don't make a lot of sense, but I think most of them miss the point. The point was that this man was killed this man was killed for speaking, I suppose, his mind. He was killed in public for speech. And that's a problem. That's a problem. Regardless of what he said, regardless of who it impacted, that's a problem that he was killed for. And I think we have to kind of remember that, like, that shouldn't happen. And I think the conspiracies try to answer questions that people want to know, but they end up missing the point of, we can't let this growing concept of people feeling like they need to do extreme acts of violence because of whatever theory or whatever is going on in their head that they feel like it's going to solve or it's going to bring attention to, is wild. It is wild, is destructive, is inappropriate, is in the spirit of the devil. Like, we should not be promoting that, and we should not be living in a world where that is so prevalent. And we're, instead of trying to figure out, oh, well, like, what was Charlie Kirk about to expose, if he was or if he wasn't, we should try to figure out, how do we keep this from happening again? How do we keep, instead of being like, oh, it had to be a left winger because they're all making fun of Charlie Kirk and blah, blah, blah. How do we find ways to say, how do we have empathy for somebody that we disagree with even when they're killed? How do we empathize with that, with their family, with the loss that they've suffered, even when that's happened? Or do we just stay in this battle of, oh, you fucked up, you did this, you did that? And like, what comes as a result of this is always the question I have. Is that, and I think to the point that we were just talking about, are we going further down the rabbit hole? Is it more hate speech? Is people digging more into their positions? Is it, is it more promoting death and violence towards the opposition? Is it more violence in general? Or or do we wake up and say, enough is enough? Whether it was him, whether it was George Floyd, whether it was Sandra Bland, whether it was young man that may have, the young white man that may have been shot by the police, whether it was a young black man that may have been shot by the police, whether it's a Jewish person beat up on for some anti-Semitic shit, whether it was Asian person that was beat up for some for some anti-immigration or anti-Asian stuff, whether it was the young lady in Charlotte that was stabbed in the neck randomly by the guy that was just sitting behind her on the train. Like, how do we get to a point of where we stop stomaching this as just demented evilness, that, oh yeah, they're just demented evil and it has to be a side that's promoting that, instead of, that shit is within us all, and we have to find a way to stomp it out. And we have to find a way to promote a world where that is not just that it's not commonplace behavior, not that it's just not accepted behavior. That shit is hated behavior again. Ostracized, hated, not valued, not wanted, not joked about, not talked about callously on the internet to make people feel like it's always a joke that can be made of it. Like, how do we get back to that? I think is the big question in terms of what comes from this. So, to conclude, I don't celebrate Charlie Kirk's murder, but I also don't mourn the death of a bigot. And I say that because, as he made multiple, I think, very crude or disrespectful comments about people like George Floyd's death. If something similar happened to me, I don't feel like he would have anything positive to say about me. So I don't say that to be like, oh, I can talk shit about him in death. I don't. I'm not doing that, and I don't believe that. I just say that to say I'm not going to mourn it. I can respect it that he passed, and I can feel empathy for his family, but I don't mourn him specifically. And, just because someone has been murdered does not mean that you have to remember them as a good person if they weren't. We talked about that. The legacy that you leave behind is the legacy that you built in life, or the things that you did in life. The things that he did in life, I think, clearly speak for themselves, for itself. And I personally are willing to take that as what it is. And I can say that, again, I understand that he was murdered. I understand, that people lost somebody, a family member of value to them. But I can also say that I believe he was a bigot that spread hate speech. And part of that was, I don't think part of that is the reason why he was killed. I'm not going to blame him for his own murder. But part of that perpetuated someone to feel like they could take his life. And that is horrible. Is and because like free speech shouldn't be punishable by death. There is a definite line to evaluate and respect between free speech and hate speech. And just to be clear, hate speech shouldn't be punishable by death either. But hate speech should be ostracized. It should be viewed as not normal. It should be viewed as something that cannot, exist in the commonplace. But I don't believe it should be, it's not a punishable by death thing either. I don't think people should be murdered for things that they believe in. But I do believe in the concept that if you think, I do believe in the concept that if you believe that that even if you have these hateful views, there that you should be able to spread them without fear of somebody murdering you for it. Or you should be able to say them. I shouldn't say spread them. You should be able to voice them without somebody murdering you for it. Doesn't mean that you should be able to be. That doesn't mean that society should accept you or should have to accept you or should want to accept you or anything like that. But I don't believe murder is ever the right avenue for that. And I think we have to use this as a warning to calm the tensions and the rhetoric down. And we have to have more empathy for each other. I've talked about that ad nauseum today. Like, we have to have more empathy for each other. On the right as much as on the left. Like, we have to. Because if not, then part of it it's not just the act. It's the reaction to the act. It's the jokes about the act. It's the constant crude dialogue about the act. All of that adds in to what other people see, to what other people interpret, to what other people think about, and them justifying it or them thinking that somebody else needs to be taken out or anything like that. It just keeps snowballing into a larger issue that will only stop when we warm ourselves and we stop being so cold and callous towards each other with that about things like this. And just to conclude, like said about Charlie Kirk, like, your actions in life will define your legacy in death. And as much as, I know some people, especially on the right, were upset that he wasn't more well received by others in his death. But I don't believe that you can hate while living and expect to be loved in death either. So with that being said, I appreciate you all for tuning in to today's episode or this week's episode. Maybe I'm just not getting the podcast. I'm your host again, Robert Davis. Once again, follow me on social media, Instagram, RTD_III, Facebook, Robert Trey Davis III. The podcast, like I said, follow, comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It's on Apple Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and on YouTube. Same name. Maybe I'm just not getting it podcast. Should be pretty easy to find on there. I appreciate all y'all support, and I'll see you on the next episode. All right, peace out.